Let's talk about numbers that should never exist. Between November 1942 and May 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a rate that would make anyone sick. On average, a B-17 crew had only a 1 in 4 chance of finishing their required 25 missions. That's not odds you'd bet on. That's flipping a coin with your life, except the coin is rigged against you. By early 1943, the average life expectancy of a bomber crew flying out of England was just 15 missions. 15. You weren't even expected to make it halfway. Now imagine a crew that beat those odds so completely, their survival seemed impossible. Not just unlikely, but statistically unbelievable, something that left even mathematicians scratching their heads. That was the story of the Memphis Belle and her crew. They flew 38 combat missions over occupied Europe and came back every single time with all 10 men alive. No deaths. Not a single crew member lost to fighters, flak, mechanical breakdown, or the 1,000 other ways men died in the skies above Germany. To give you perspective, while the Belle was flying, the 8th Air Force was losing an average of 40 bombers on every major raid. That's 400 men gone in just one afternoon. The 91st Bomb Group, which the Memphis Belle was part of, was called the Ragged Irregulars, partly because they had taken such heavy losses early in the war. On one mission to St. Nazaire in November 1942, they lost 4 out of 12 aircraft, 37 men killed or captured in a single day. Yet there was Captain Robert Morgan's crew, mission after mission, coming home in a bomber full of holes, but with everyone still alive. Pentagon statisticians couldn't explain it. When they considered the flak over places like Wilhelmshaven or the fighter swarms defending the Ruhr Valley, the Belle's survival simply didn't fit the math. And here's the thing. It wasn't because the Belle had easy targets. This wasn't luck from milk runs. Morgan's crew bombed submarine pens at St. Nazaire, aircraft factories in Bremen, and ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt. These were missions where the Luftwaffe threw everything at them. Veteran German pilots in FW-190s and Bf-109s attacked with precision, knowing exactly where the B-17's blind spots were and how much damage the bomber could take before it broke apart. Surviving in a B-17 over Germany in 1943 was stacked against you in every possible way. You were 25,000 feet up in a thin aluminum shell, carrying 2,500 gallons of high-octane fuel and tons of explosives. Outside, it was 40 below zero. Around you, 88 mm shells burst, each one blasting shrapnel across a 75-foot radius. One chunk of metal the size of your thumb could punch through the skin, cut a fuel line, or rip away a control surface. And you flew in tight formation, so if one bomber exploded, it could take 2 or 3 with it. Yet Morgan brought his crew home through this gauntlet 38 times. Every mission ended the same. He taxied the Belle back to Bassingbourn, shut down the 4 Wright Cyclone engines, and all 10 men climbed out alive. Ground crews started treating the Memphis Belle as if she were charmed. Other crews touched her before flights, hoping some of her luck would rub off. Long before the War Department promoted her, before Hollywood filmed her, before she toured for war bonds, the Belle had already become a symbol. Proof that you could survive this grinder. Proof that statistics weren't destiny, and that skill, and maybe a little luck, could beat the odds. Robert Morgan wasn't meant to be a famous name. Born in Asheville, North Carolina in 1918, he was just 23 when he flew combat over Europe. His father ran a small business, nothing special. Like so many in his generation, Morgan grew up through the Great Depression. What set him apart was an obsession with flying. At 14, he spent hours at his local airfield until someone finally let him sit in a cockpit. By 16, he'd saved enough from odd jobs to take lessons. He soloed before he even had a driver's license. When Morgan enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1940, he already had more flying hours than some of his instructors. The system wasn't designed for recruits who already knew how to fly. Training programs were meant to take complete beginners and turn them into barely competent pilots. But Morgan sped through primary, advanced, and multi-engine training like he was ticking boxes. By early 1942, with his wings in hand, the Army desperately needed B-17 pilots for new squadrons in England. That's when Morgan's unique style of leadership started to show. The Army wanted rigid, by-the-book command, strict hierarchy, clear orders. Morgan ignored half of it. He looked at his crew, most of them barely older than kids, and decided to treat them as a team instead of subordinates. His bombardier, Vince Evans, was 21. His navigator, Chuck Layton, was 22. The waist gunners were teenagers. So Morgan held crew meetings where everyone could speak up, even the lowest-ranking man. If the tail gunner had worries about fighter attacks from 6 o'clock, Morgan listened. If the engineer thought an engine was running rough, it mattered. That wasn't normal. Most commanders ruled their crews with an iron fist. Morgan built his on trust. And his men knew he valued their lives as much as the mission, which changed everything in combat. The Memphis Belle herself rolled out of Boeing S Plant 2 in Seattle in September 1942. She was a B-17F, serial number 41-24585, painted in standard olive drab and gray. Nothing unusual, one of thousands built with Wright R-1820 engines, 50 caliber machine guns, and a Norden bomb sight. Morgan named her after his girlfriend back in Memphis, Margaret Polk, and got a commercial artist to paint her pinup on the nose, just like hundreds of other crews did. But what made the Belle different was who flew her. Morgan didn't just accept any assigned crew. He handpicked men for more than skill. He wanted personalities that could stay calm when everything was falling apart. His co-pilot, Jim Varinas, was steady as a rock. His top turret gunner and engineer, Staff Sergeant Harold Locke, could strip and rebuild an engine blindfolded. One by one, Morgan built not just a crew, but a survival machine. The Belle landed at Bassingbourn in September 1942, and Morgan's crew had just 6 weeks to figure out what combat meant before their first mission. Nothing in training prepared you for real flak and fighters. You could practice formation flying all day, but nothing compared to watching the bomber beside you explode, throwing debris past your wing. Their first mission was on November 7, 1942, submarine pens at Brest, France. The 8th Air Force was still learning daylight bombing the hard way. Morgan's crew joined 31 other B-17s, and the moment they crossed the French coast, the sky filled with flak. Black puffs of 88mm bursts appeared all around, each one capable of tearing a bomber apart. Inside, it was chaos. Engines roaring, machine guns firing, wind screaming through holes, and every nearby explosion shaking the plane like a hammer blow. Morgan learned something crucial on that first mission, something that would shape his survival strategy for the next 37. When German fighters attacked, most pilots' instinct was to break formation, to dodge, to try to escape. But Morgan saw what happened to the bombers that left formation. They got picked off immediately. The Luftwaffe hunted stragglers, damaged planes, or anyone who couldn't keep up. So Morgan set a rule for his crew that went against human instinct. Stay in formation no matter what, even if a fighter was coming head-on. Even if flak was bursting right where they had to fly. Staying tight with the group was the only thing that gave them a chance, because only the combined defensive firepower of the formation could keep them alive. The learning curve was brutal. On their third mission, November 23rd, the 91st Bomb Group was mauled over Saint-Nazaire. German fighters attacked in waves. Morgan watched B-17s spiral down in flames. One bomber took a direct flak hit and disintegrated instantly. 10 men gone in a heartbeat. Another, hit by cannon fire, fell out of formation with both engines ablaze. From his turret, Tony Nastall watched that crew bail out, white parachutes dotting the winter sky. Those men were prisoners if lucky, dead if not. But the Belle came home. She had holes in the wings, hydraulic lines cut, and an engine running rough. Yet all 10 men were untouched. When the ground crew counted, they found 18 flak holes in the fuselage and wings. 18 pieces of shrapnel that could have hit a cable, a fuel line, or a man, but didn't. Morgan refused to call it luck. He called it flying properly, holding formation, not giving the Germans an easy kill. By December 1942, the crew had developed the rhythm that kept them alive. Navigator Chuck Layton could chart routes that shaved time over the worst defended zones. Bombardier Vince Evans was so precise with the Norden bomb sight that they often hit targets on the first pass, reducing time in the killing zone. The gunners, 10 50 caliber machine guns spread around the bomber, were learning to conserve ammo, fire only when fighters were in range, and call out threats calmly even under attack. Each mission added to their knowledge. They learned German tactics, the difference between feints and real attacks. They learned to read flak patterns, to brace when the bombardier said bomb bay doors open, because that meant more drag, more vulnerability. On January 27, 1943, they saw what maximum effort meant. The target was Wilhelmshaven, Germany's major naval base, and it was the 8th Air Force's first large-scale raid into German airspace. That morning, 53 B-17s and 41 B-24s launched. German radar tracked them immediately, and controllers vectored every available Bf-109 and Fw-190 to intercept. Morgan watched contrails of fighters forming above the bomber stream, preparing head-on dives at 500 meters mpk. The bombers had maybe 3 seconds of firing time before the fighters shot past. Morgan saw one Fw-190 rake the bomber off his left wing. Cannon shells shattered the nose plexiglass, killing both pilots. The stricken B-17 plunged, and Morgan had to yank his own plane clear. That day, 8 B-17s and 3 B-24s were lost. The Belle took cannon fire that punched holes in her tail and tore aluminum skin from the fuselage, but Morgan stayed in formation and got her home. On April 17, 1943, they hit Bremen, home to Focke-Wulf aircraft factories. It was defended like Berlin itself. The flak was so thick, pilots said you could walk on it. Straight through they went. No evasive turns, just level flight through walls of fire. When the Belle landed, they counted 97 flak holes. 97. The bomber looked shredded. Shrapnel passed through the radio room where the operator had stood seconds earlier, and another piece sliced through 3 hydraulic lines, forcing Morgan to land on emergency systems. Evans even had a fragment tear through his flight suit without touching his skin, and yet they all walked away again. Then came August 17, 1943. By then the Belle was back in the States, but Morgan heard the reports. Regensburg and Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force's darkest day. The plan had been bold: hit the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, then the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. In reality, it gave the Germans 2 chances to slaughter the bombers. At Regensburg, 24 out of 146 B-17s were lost. At Schweinfurt, 36 out of 230. In one day, 60 bombers were gone, 600 men killed, missing, or captured. Some groups lost nearly half their aircraft. Others were so shattered they couldn't form a combat box again. This was the nightmare scenario every crew knew could happen. And it proved what Morgan had been drilling into his men. The bombers that died were almost always stragglers, aircraft with damage, or crews who panicked and broke formation. The Belle had survived precisely because Morgan never let that happen. His survival wasn't magic or chance. It was a system, built mission by mission, lesson by lesson, learning from every close call. First rule: formation flying wasn't for show. The B-17 was designed for mutual defense. With 13 machine guns per bomber, 18 or 24 aircraft in close formation created a web of overlapping fire. Morgan flew so close his wingtip was sometimes less than 10 feet from the next plane. His co-pilot, Jim Varinis, later said Morgan would rather risk a mid-air collision than give the Luftwaffe an opening. The second survival method was altitude management. Most B-17 pilots flew at their assigned height and stayed there. Morgan kept making tiny changes: climb 50 feet here, drop 75 feet there, never holding the exact same altitude for more than a minute or two on the way to the target. Formation leaders hated this because it made station keeping harder, but it turned the Belle into a nightmare for German flak crews to track. The 80mm guns were deadly when they could predict your exact height and course. If you flew straight and level, the German crews would bracket you. One shot low, one high, watch the impacts, then put the next one right through your cockpit. By constantly varying altitude a little, Morgan made it much harder for the gunners to get a firing solution. Morgan also became almost obsessive about maintenance between missions. Most pilots landed, debriefed, and left the airplane to the ground crew. Morgan walked the entire bomber after every sortie, personally checking every patch, every repair, every replaced part. He crawled into the bomb bay to check the racks, climbed into the tail to inspect control cables, and examined each engine cowling for cracks or loose rivets. His crew chief, John Quinlan, said, "Morgan knew that airplane better than some mechanics. If something looked, sounded, or felt wrong, the Belle didn't fly until it was fixed. They even sat out missions if he refused to take off with a rough engine or a hydraulic system with unstable pressure." The third technique was energy management during fighter attacks. When German fighters slashed through the formation, most pilots tried to maneuver, bank away, dive, climb, anything to not be where the bullets were. Morgan did the opposite. He would fly toward the attacking fighter, hold formation, and make slight angle changes, so the fighter had to keep correcting aim. A Bf-109 diving at 400 mph had maybe 2 seconds to line up a shot. If the bomber wasn't exactly where the fighter expected, those cannon shells missed. Morgan made himself a harder target without breaking formation. The worst thing you could do. He also trained his crew to communicate with absolute precision under fire. No yelling, no panic, just clear calls. "Fighter 12 o'clock high, 3 miles, closing fast." The gunners held their fire until the fighter was in effective range, about 400 yards for the 50 cal. Inexperienced crews often opened up at 800 to 1,000 yards, wasting ammo and giving away their position. Morgan's gunners were disciplined. Track, judge deflection, wait for a clean shot, then fire short, controlled bursts where the fighter would be. His top turret gunner, Harold Locke, was credited with 3 German fighters during their tour, exceptional for a B-17 gunner. They also used hand signals because the intercom was often unreliable or jammed with voices. A specific tap on the co-pilot's shoulder meant, "I'm making a formation adjustment. Be ready to take over if I'm hit." The flight engineer had signals for engine problems. The navigator could signal course changes without tying up the line. This kept critical info moving even when the radios were damaged or the electrics were acting up, which happened a lot. Most important, Morgan built a culture of shared responsibility. Every man watched out for everyone else. The ball turret gunner wasn't only guarding the belly. He watched for damaged bombers below that might drift up into their box. By late April 1943, they had flown 24 missions, and the pressure of being so close to the finish was its own torture. The Army Air Forces set 25 missions as the magic number. Finish 25 and you could go home. You had survived. The problem was that crews at 20 or 21 started flying differently. They got cautious. They thought about survival more than the mission. That's when mistakes got made. Morgan saw it happen. Men who reached 18 or 20 missions then got shot down on number 23 because they hesitated or broke formation at the worst moment. The Belle's crew reached their 25th on May 17, 1943, hitting the submarine pens at Lorient, France. That should have been the finish line. But there was confusion over whether an earlier mission counted. Some sorties were scrubbed after takeoff for weather, and there was debate about whether those counted. The 91st Bomb Group records had the Belle at 24 completed, not 25. Morgan's crew had a choice that would break lesser men: argue the count and maybe go home, or fly more missions to remove all doubt. They flew again on May 19th, hitting Kiel on the Baltic. By most counts, that was number 26, and the flak over Kiel was as bad as anything they'd seen. The Germans had moved extra 88mm batteries to protect U-boat yards. The Belle took hits in the number 2 engine. It ran rough and lost oil pressure. Morgan feathered the prop and finished the mission on 3 engines, which meant less power, lower altitude, and higher risk. They still made it home. 2 more followed, Wilhelmshaven on June 11th and Bremen on June 13th. Each time they went up, the odds got worse. Every mission was another roll of the dice in a game where the house always wins eventually. The final mission came on June 19, 1943. Some sources call it their 37th or 38th, depending on how you count scrubbed flights. The target again was Wilhelmshaven. By then, Morgan's crew had hit that naval base 4 times. The defenders knew American routes and altitudes. It should have been a shooting gallery. The Luftwaffe put up 70 fighters, and the flak was so dense, pilots said you couldn't see through it. Just solid black clouds the formation had to fly through blind. Morgan took the Belle into that hell one last time, knowing this was the final roll of the dice. Bombardier Vince Evans had to make 3 passes because clouds hid the aim point on the first 2. 3 passes meant triple exposure to flak. Each pass took about 4 minutes of straight level flight while German crews walked their sights onto the bomber. On the 3rd run, Evans got a clear picture, dropped, and called bombs away. Morgan immediately began a turn-off target, diving slightly to build speed, getting out of the flak zone as fast as 4 Wright Cyclone engines could haul them. A shell burst close enough to slam the Belle sideways. Shrapnel tore through the left wing and punctured fuel tanks. Morgan watched fuel stream out, a vapor trail pointing them out to every fighter nearby. He transferred fuel to a different tank and prayed they had enough to cross the North Sea. Flight engineer Harold Locke did fuel math in his head while watching the gauges, calling updates every few minutes. They had enough, barely. The formation crossed the English coast at 14:30 hours. Morgan saw Bassingbourn's runway ahead. He brought the Belle in with 2,000 pounds less fuel than he wanted and yellow hydraulic warnings on 2 systems. The landing was smooth. He greased it on despite battle damage and fuel risk. When the props stopped, the silence felt unreal. The Memphis Belle became a symbol before anyone grasped what it meant for the wider war. By May 1943, American papers were desperate for good news from Europe. North Africa was ending well, but the bombing of Germany wasn't delivering what the public had been promised. Losses were staggering. Every week brought stories of local boys shot down over France or Germany. The War Department needed a counter-story, proof that American airmen could survive, could win, could beat the odds. The Belle arrived at the perfect moment. A crew that finished their tour with 0 casualties, flying a photogenic bomber with a pinup on the nose and a name that rolled off the tongue. The AAF Public Relations Office saw it instantly. In June 1943, even before Morgan's full debriefs and after-action reports were done, plans were moving to bring the Belle and her crew back to the United States for a war bond tour. That wasn't standard. Most veterans went to training roles or helped form new crews. But the publicity power of the Memphis Belle was too big to ignore. The bond tour launched in July 1943 and became a nationwide phenomenon. Morgan and his crew visited 31 cities in 3 months, from New York to Los Angeles, drawing crowds in the tens of thousands. People lined up for blocks just to see the Memphis Belle, to touch her aluminum skin, or to peek into the cockpit where Captain Morgan had sat during 38 missions. The bomber itself became almost sacred. Parents lifted children up to touch her fuselage, hoping that the Belle's survival luck might protect their own sons flying over Europe. The tour raised over $50 million in war bonds, about $800 million today, enough to build dozens of new bombers. But the deeper impact wasn't financial. The Memphis Belle made the air war personal in a way numbers never could. When Morgan stood on a stage in Cleveland or Chicago, describing flak over Bremen, German fighters ripping through formations, and bringing his crew home again and again, it gave Americans a real connection to the war in the skies. It wasn't abstract casualty figures anymore. It was Bob Morgan, a 24-year-old from North Carolina, who looked like any neighbor's son, and who had survived what most never did. Hollywood director William Wyler had even flown combat missions with the Belle's crew in 1943, filming footage that became the Memphis Belle, a story of a flying fortress. Wyler flew 5 combat missions himself, shooting over 16,000 feet of film from the ball turret and waist gun positions. The 1944 documentary premiered in theaters across America, shown before the main feature. For the first time, Americans saw real combat footage from inside a bomber, flak bursts shaking the aircraft, fighters charging through, the faces of young men in combat. It won widespread acclaim and cemented the Belle's reputation as the bomber that proved survival was possible. Morgan's methods also shaped Air Force training. When he returned home, he was tasked with teaching new crews his tactics, formation discipline, altitude variation, and crew coordination. These became part of the training program. Whether they improved survival rates is debatable. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang long-range escorts in 1944 saved far more crews than any tactical lesson. Still, Morgan's influence was significant. The Bond tour and the documentary also served a hidden purpose. By mid-1943, the 8th Air Force was facing a morale crisis. Desertions were rising, refusal to fly cases appeared, and psychiatric casualties reached nearly 10% of all personnel. Many men broke down after 15 or 16 missions. The Memphis Belle became a psychological weapon, proof that you could finish a tour, that survival wasn't just chance. Whether it was ethical, using one lucky crew's story to encourage thousands of others into deadly skies, is something historians still debate. Modern research shows the truth was more complex. While Morgan's record was extraordinary, it wasn't as unique as wartime publicity made it seem. Several B-17 crews finished 25 mission tours without casualties. The 303rd Bomb Group's Hell's Angels actually hit 25 missions 8 days before the Belle. But the War Department had already chosen Morgan's crew for publicity. Still, flying 38 missions without losing a man was exceptional. Studies of 8th Air Force records show survival usually peaked around 20 missions, then declined as fatigue and stress took over. Somehow, Morgan's crew maintained performance well past that point. Psychologists credit his leadership, shared decisions, mutual trust, and giving every man a voice, for preventing the psychological collapse that crippled so many others. The tactical lessons live on. Modern military aviation doctrine still stresses formation integrity, accepting individual risk to protect the group, disciplined maneuvering instead of panic, and trust in your wingmen. The technology has changed, but the principles go back to the B-17 combat boxes over Europe. The Belle herself survived the war. After the Bond tour, she went to training duty, then was handed to the city of Memphis as a memorial. She sat outdoors for decades, corroding in the weather, before being moved to Mud Island. In 2005, she was transferred to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Specialists spent 13 years restoring her to her 1943 state. In 2018, the restoration was complete, and today she sits in the W. Paus Gallery, looking just as she did over Germany. Robert Morgan lived a long, complex life with his fame. He flew a second combat tour in the Pacific, piloting B-29s against Japan and finishing another 26 missions. After the war, he stayed in the Air Force until 1965, retiring as a colonel. He spent his later years tied to the Memphis Belle, attending air shows, speaking at events, always asked about those 38 missions. He died in 2004 at age 85, outliving most of his crew. In his last interviews, Morgan admitted luck was always part of it. Yes, he had made smart choices and had an exceptional team, but he'd watched equally skilled crews die on routine flights. The randomness of combat never left him. The Memphis Belle's legacy isn't about being the toughest bomber or the deadliest. Others survived more damage or scored higher kill counts. What she represented was possibility. The chance of survival in a war where survival seemed impossible. She proved that skill, discipline, teamwork, and yes, luck could sometimes beat the odds that killed 70% of airmen. Every crew that flew after the Belle carried that knowledge with them. Some made it home, most did not. But they all knew it could be done, because Bob Morgan and his men had done it 38 times. In a war where so much depended on generals and politicians, where individual actions often seemed meaningless, the Memphis Belle showed that what a single crew did together could matter, that survival was possible. That is why her story endures, why the restored bomber still draws crowds in Dayton, and why Morgan's name is still remembered by anyone who studies the air war over Europe. The Memphis Belle proved that in the worst of circumstances, discipline and determination could shift the odds, even if only slightly, even if only for a few.